myself first. I live in Tainan now, but I'm from the Aki Anishinaabe, and I teach at the Settler Colonial Institution of the University of Ottawa in what is called Canada. Canada is a Mohawk word for village. I would like to begin our keynote speech by the last keynote speech of the time, but acknowledging that we are in Hsinchu, in a place which was formerly called in Chinese Zuxian, or the Dutch called it Bokal, and it was the traditional territory of the Daukas, or the Dauka Sizu, who have resisted colonialism for a long time. Under the Dutch and Koshinga periods, they were first colonized in 1711 by Han settlement, and by 1850, because of internecine warfare among Han groups, they scattered across Taiwan. And of course, after the war, another group of people came here, including bringing with them Jiao Da. So this is a colonial situation, just like many other places in the world, and I want to recognize the Daukas people. It is now a great pleasure that I introduce to you our keynote speaker, Tess. She is an anthropologist who specializes in the analysis of indigenous navigation of settler colonial policies, among other things, militarization and extraction. Her most recent book is called Wild Policy, Indigeneity and the Unruly Logics of Intervention. And she is between the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, and Macquarie University in Australia, where, as she said last night, she's going to become very deanly. So with no further ado, I will let the speaker take over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. I've been reminded to hold the microphone close and to speak as loudly as I can. I'll try very hard. Okay. I want to also acknowledge that I was born on the lands of the Larrakia in Darwin in the north of Australia, which already makes me an unusual Australian. So Darwin is unknown to most Australians, and at one point in time, Chinese people there outnumbered white people 7-1, introducing the very reason for the White Australia policy as Australia's first piece of legislation when it first became federated. Very interesting from a policy perspective. Going in and out with this one. I can hear it going in and out. Yeah. They took that away, Ned. So, okay. Look, one way of looking at all of this is we know we're in a university. If we had perfectly functioning everything, we wouldn't be in a university. All right, so we know where we are. Okay. Well, I pre-wrote anticipating this, that I would be genuinely inspired and motivated and revitalised by listening to other presentations at this conference. Like, I pre-wrote that as a sentence. But now I say it with my hand on my heart and with warm gratitude to Joyce and others for creating such a configuration of disciplines and topics. I've had a very big year to date. It started in December with a basement flood where I lost 50% of all of my academic books. That was followed in March by a comprehensive house burglary where I lost all of my research data and my car and clothes and, jewellery and some other things. But my laptop, my hard drive, all USB discs and field notebooks. So if you're an anthropologist, you realise my heart has been taken out and trampled on. However, I feel like all of that is a necessary part of assembling me to be here today with gratitude, properly embodied. I'll come back to that. In listening to everyone else's papers, I am, as I often am in international contexts, humbled by people's multilingualism, multiculturalism, internationalism. As a monolingual cisgendered white woman from Australia, I am necessarily more parochial. I'm also more parochial because my information is coming to you from very emplaced sorts of examples. And I tend not to then be able to come up with grand universal theory. So I turn to others for that. But nonetheless, these Australian origins, I think, take us to the heart of the question of whether decolonisation is actually possible for people like me, identified as white, cisgendered, and able-bodied, given my existing expectations about the affordances that I require to live well in this world, and the acknowledgement, increasingly, my ways of being in the world are also impossible and untenable, unviable for planetary well-being. So that's one contradiction. In my research, I've examined settler bureaucracies and policy formations and their mediations within Indigenous life worlds across public health, schools, infrastructure, housing, mining, militarism, and climate change. And throughout, and in some of those, I've actually also been a bureaucrat, I should say that very clearly. I've been a ministerial advisor. I've introduced legislation. Yeah. Blame me for some of the terrible smoking restrictions, smokers. Sorry, not sorry. And throughout, I've tried to understand settler administrative power, what it comprises, and how something better might be wrangled out of it, given that it can't just be wished away, there being no parlour trick to making centuries of ruinous structures evaporate without a trace. This is not a passive location from which to tolerate the intolerable, but nor is it decolonisation. Let me be very clear. Because if decolonisation is to be more than an acceptable institutional jargon, aka University of British Columbia, where it's a very sophisticated jargon, then, as the Métis artist David Garneau argues, its goal must be to bring about, quote, the repatriation of Indigenous land and life, which also means inevitably that it's an unfinished project, permanently unfinished project, partly because none of us are planning to go away. So mine is a search for some more immediate ways to alter intolerable systems within this permanently unfinished agenda. Because not only is settler colonialism a process, so is decolonisation by definition. Settler colonial administrative power has the dual feature of being both omnipresent and one of the few tools available to us to demand restitution within a bloodless paradigm. So unless you're imagining very bloody takeovers, then what we're looking to often is some form of policy redress, some turn to legislation, some turn to regulation, some turn to some assemblage of governance which asks us to be otherwise. And I interrogate that very liberal assumption. That's my work. So I think through the potential and the limits of governance mechanisms. So in the following, this is just the itinerary, I'm going to briefly trace how I've come to think of settler colonial policy as having constancy but no consistency, which explains its wildness, in how it organises relations of inequality. I'll detour to briefly explain what I mean when I talk about policy and explore the limits of sustainable Indigenous housing as just a little brief example of those limits and those potentials, before confessing on your last day that I do not know if decolonisation is even a possibility, whilstsoever we have default expectations of uninterrupted functioning from the extractive systems that subtend our current arrangements for our life supports. And where this lands me is a new set of problems, which I feel like is a very fine point to kind of be a final keynote on. End with some new questions. But I also lack the imagination to resolve those questions, so don't look to me. So first, what and where is policy? Well, I've been looking at this for 3 decades, not really very satisfied with what the political scientists ever told me about what or where is policy. So I had to spend 10 years coming up with my own heuristic, which is this. I tend to think of policy as simultaneously and all at once, both artifactual, or not artifactual, ambient and hauntological. Quickly whiz through what those 3 terms mean, because this is not really about this heuristic. So policy artifacts is policy in its most recognisable guise. It's what we mostly imagine when we talk about policy. It's legislation, it's statecraft, it's black and white documents, usually identifiable by very banal prose that's hard to read, but nonetheless very consequential prose. And it almost always, when critics come to this kind of policy, they resort to discourse analysis of one kind or another, and they turn to Foucault. So that's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. That's a very good thing to follow policy artefacts. But it also introduces some artefacts of thinking, which I don't have the time to go into, but I've written a book about it. Then there's what I call ambient policy. So this is just policy sunk into our surroundings, no longer given a proper name, taken for granted. We're living in it right now, you're sitting in it right now. This is regulatory heights and depths and air qualities and all sorts of things, even as I will go on to explain. The permissions given to get the cement, to extract the sand, to get the cement, to get these stairs into this room. So that's ambient policy. And methodologically, that tends to invite structural analyses of one kind or another. And then there's what I call policy hauntology. This is when policy is sitting inside our bodies and our minds and our psyches and our DNA, our imaginations and our traumas and our hopes and our optimisms, as it's a permanently present absence. So, clearly, for me, policy is not simply, as jurisprudence or political science approaches would have it, a normative determination which journeys from conception to implementation, and which we then criticise for having quote-unquote unintended consequences. I might just hit the next person who tells me about unintended consequences. It's such a stupid category of analysis. Policy is mercurial, always, and its heft is also anything but straightforward. A very deathly policy can be so subdued, so quiet, that it settles into place with barely a whisper. Take, for example, a policy which invites a separate foreign nation state to detonate nuclear bombs inside Australian borders, on top of Australian citizens, which was agreed to without the National Cabinet even being aware. It was just a straightforward deal between Menzies and the United Kingdom. Come and blow up your bombs on top of Indigenous people, it's fine. Other policies can be so much a part of the landscape that they lose their association with policy altogether, and they reside in our bodies and our psyches. In this way, they can represent the very essence of coloniality. So I just want to take us on a little journey to explain some of that. So little experiment. Picture in your mind a sidewalk and a road that is used by cars, one that takes you alongside different activities. And just hold that picture in your mind. It can be any road you want. Recall its dimensions, its width and its depth, and think of who has jurisdiction over its upkeep. How loud or large the vehicles are allowed to be, where the liability for any trip hazards are legally accepted or refused. They're on you. Consider the ageism, the sexism, the ableism, the class relations, the overall subordination of pedestrian and all other environmental actors to motorised vehicles that takes place along your imagined strip. Think on how that land had always had different destinies. And we're talking about 1/4 to 2/5 of all available public land, just by the way, when we're talking about roads. Think of the land as at once belonging to others. Factory owners at one point, farmers perhaps, Indigenous peoples always, rocks, waterways, critters, and the policies which enabled these assorted inclusions, exclusions, lives and deaths. Let your minds branch out to the extraction industries, which subtend the conversion of river sands into concrete, crude oil into tar, earth beds into gravel quarries. So, this is part of your road. All of these are policy-saturated entailments that have become so naturalised, so ambient, if you will, that they are no longer accorded a proper formal policy presence. They have lost their artefactual status. Yet we inherit and relay these necro-policy valences so very well. It's the first lesson you will teach any toddler. We will yank their arms out of their sockets if they dare to venture too close to a busy road, and we'll say, don't do that, with our psyches screeching at them with the fear of that deathscape. That's policy hauntology. Okay. So policies are also spectral, and they linger as differentiated conditions of possibility. And in Australia, if you're the child of a child of a child of a white male of a certain vintage who survived a tour of duty, perhaps somewhere here, certainly in Singapore, a tour of duty as a soldier in World War II, a soldier who returned sound in mind and body, and you were white, you might still be benefiting from the land packages and the free tertiary education that grandfather was given or great-grandfather was given. Alternatively, yours could be the inheritance of an alcohol-fueled masculinity passing on techniques for self-medicalising PTSD, and perhaps yours is also the epigenetic imprint of past policies born of the same ravages from men with PTSD being allowed onto your territories like discarded dogs to find some way of working out their own psychic trauma on your territory, which is how my country, the Northern Territory, was so-called opened up. So I came up with the concept of wild policy. You can perhaps see why when I started to think about what is policy actually, to signal that interaction, which exists within any situation that we might find ourselves. Okay, so to recap, so that was a brief tour. These are just devices to help me pass some of those things, but they're all of these things all of the time. So with that very swift attempt at a rubric to describe settler colonial policies as I understand them done, let me now move to what understanding policies as an actor in a pluriversal system might add when we're thinking about decolonisation. So policies are indeed a tool, factually, that can be wielded to change conditions. But at least in Australia, progressive achievements are always hard won, and they're always fragile to hold. So to answer a question I was asked yesterday, is it meant to be this hard? The answer is yes, because it is not meant to be easy. The things that are made to be easy are those primary devices, which I'll get onto next. Primary extractive capitalism is always the prior and the present and the future, for instance, of Indigenous conditions of possibility. I won't derail on to explaining that, but ask me about it. The experience of Indigenous Australians under continuous occupation is that of endurance in a nation which first cleared for itself the rights to property, to land and labour, and followed this with clearing the Crown's access to subsurface resources. This is really important. In the Northern Territory, for instance, under really hard-won land rights, reclamation activities, Indigenous people have been able to get back 50% of their land and 85% of it nonetheless. 85% of that 50% is still subject to exploration licences. The Northern Territory Land Rights Act is the best and first in class in Australia. The rest is a watered down diminution of that first act because the federal government went, oh my God, this is going too far, let's retract some of these affordances. And as this little chart tells us, little use on land use chart in Australia. Most land in Australia is under some form of lease, freehold or pastoral, which also permits mining. So I'm just trying to shorthand. Can we just call this the extractive complex and not have that be highly contested? So overall, the Australian extractive policy regime operates on a very simple rule that uniquely the state crown owns most minerals a priori. And it was able to be so clear in that primary extraction from learning from other imperial and colonial enterprises elsewhere. How do you make this nice and easy? So you can have easy policy, and this is it. As the legal scholar Anne Fitzgerald notes, the adoption of policy of public ownership of minerals and petroleum sets Australia apart from other major common law countries where more commonly extensive private ownership of minerals is the norm. Okay, so how did it become so clear and so easy? Well, that's to do with these other colonial policy tributaries, and you can trace that if you want to. Can it be otherwise? Of course, let's hope so. But this would take us to the contradictions of the Anthropocene and what it requires for the world to flourish. Decolonisation must be total. Mind, body, extractive life supports. It's not a philosophy, or not a philosophy alone. It's not dematerialised. So my collaborations with Indigenous people over time suggest that it is possible to live otherwise in the world. But they've also taught me not to be romantic about what that refusal requires, and to also acknowledge my complicity, or if you prefer, my implicity, with what Indigenous people must endure and refuse to enable the brutalism and the affordances of industrial settler life worlds, the life worlds that we're sitting in. So I'll skip this next bit, but pretty much my ability to be here today is also this, which is Glencore's mining operation on the McArthur River mine. Glencore is the mafia of mining operations. This is polluting the river, and the Indigenous people there are amongst the most impoverished in Australia to this day. So this enables the safe shielding for the X-ray vision and the nuclear treatments that I got for my sun-scarred skin, a melanoma here, a cancer on the eyelid there, to the batteries sitting inside this now working microphone. To transcend the ruinous life habits of colonisation, we need to seize, sabotage and reconfigure our infrastructural worlds, becoming more communal and necessarily less convenient, divesting of fossil fuels and their myriad affordances, among many other things. So just to prefigure my question, who's volunteering? I mean, I'm sharing a washing machine at the moment in the apartment block that I'm in, and I hate it. I hate somebody else's tissue washing through my clothing. You know, it's a tiny little example of a communal life world. Okay, so extractivism is embedded in our quotidian surroundings and our operating cultures. It's in our bodies. And we get to benefit greatly. Let me just have a very quick, brief, year-round strawberries. What a wondrous thing. Okay. So the short take on this is that a lot of this activity for this wondrous life world, all of it, depending on your point of view, takes place on Indigenous estates, current and or prior. And in liberal settler communities like Australia, despite these dependencies, we tacitly cleave to the possibility that the benevolent state is nonetheless going to confer equality on a racialised basis. And that's what we should be calling for. And it's important to do so. We have a very big debate about that right now, but it's radically insufficient. Based on that benevolence model, in some critiques of the relationship between decolonisation, indigeneity and climate change, it can be naively proposed that all we need to do is listen to Indigenous people, be in good relations with them, and things like bushfire management of the kind that have just wrapped through Maui and are anticipated to be our next 3 years in Australia. Water care and less exploitative relationships to the overall environment will somehow prevail in wiser policy formations. Someone, somewhere, will see the correctness of our vision, and transformation in some policy somewhere will take place bloodlessly, costlessly. It seems to be the end point, the parachute, in many of the analyses that I see in environmental humanities and other very poetic accounts of our current conditions and some resolutions. And they seem to me quite lazy, and I wish they were true, but they are lazy. Sorry, just saying. But it's from within those contradictions that I do my thinking. I think that this kind of administrative optimism at its heart is radically insufficient, even whilst it's important to prefigure. Relying on the system for our resets and our redress and for restorative justice when no one plans on vacating overtaken lands or overturning our dominant organisational life support systems, nor are we thinking about taking over the institutions. It's all a little bit all care, no responsibility. So better policy is indispensable to all of this, and its indispensability is part of the problem, to put this into a very shorthand. So in the meantime, what can we do? Well, the next little example is trying to think about that. What can we do in the meantime, knowing that it's all a bit impossible, but what can we do nonetheless? Because doing nothing is also not feasible. I tend to turn complex things into simple questions, and this complex thing, I thought to myself, well, shelter has to be a key part of anyone's ability to endure what we are in now and what comes next. The ability to survive in Australia, increasingly inhospitable temperatures being among them, right? Australia is really at the front lines of climate change. So I asked this of Indigenous housing. So infrastructures are interestingly like policies. Like, I'm going to create a metaphor here, in that they seem to be really solid, they seem to be permanent, but in fact they are always in a process of disassembly. They're always falling apart. The plane was falling apart prior to its assembly. Engineers have a concept of, well, not just engineers, but the second law of thermodynamics is our trend towards permanent entropy. So entropy is the permanence. So being inherently unstable, infrastructures also require a lot of labour to hold them together. They're held together by assortments of skilled and unskilled, well-paid, ill-paid, exploited, indentured, enslaved and donated labours across the world, which links us to the conversations about slavery and migrations and so on. Broken or well-maintained, regardless, Western infrastructures have become unavoidable or ambient, and inherently colonial in their form and their function, to the point where vernacular architectures, I'm skipping over a lot of stuff, but the vernacular architectures and vernacular architectural knowledge has been lost across the world because of the rollout, for instance, of air conditioning. People have not needed to have thermal autonomy otherwise. So a universal housing type has kind of colonised building forms across the world, leaving us with some very atrophied knowledge forms. So demanding more resilient housing is a kind of minimalist requirement for enduring a world that is always already toxic and in various stages of collapse. Okay, so I asked, in my habit of asking simple questions, what will prolonged heat, wilder weather, water theft and drowned seaports do for the minority populations in Australia, Indigenous people, in out-of-mind parts of Australia, as the world's population balloons with its existential requirements for more extractive infrastructure? Was my question, and I did a study. Very quickly, I found that the word sustainability does a lot of heavy work in reports and analysis, often without much meaning, and usually as a pretext for business as usual. It's also a form of statecraft, enabling us to imagine that there's a safely democratic techno-fix to radical inequality, as if this is perfectly possible. Programs which systematically maintain the amenity of public housing stock on a planned rather than reactive basis can reduce costs. Did a huge case study to show it can change infrastructure maintenance costs by 70%. If any of you are thinking that policy change operates on such logics, I'm here to tell you it doesn't. Because planned maintenance in public housing is rarely achieved anywhere. The norm is erratic. Okay, I can elaborate. There's a lot of details here. The next question was, even if maintenance was happening, so ideally, and it was planned, and it was well funded, and the labour was consistent, and it was expert, and it was non-exploitative, and it was not asking for sex from the teenage girls in exchange for plumbing, even if none of that was happening, it was all good, then what is being maintained sufficient now for thermal autonomy, let alone with 1.5 degrees of global warming, which is already impossible. 1.5 is already too optimistic. So to test this, we created a typology of typical housing models to create a composite 3-bedroom house. And we kaleidoscoped that standard 3-bedroom house through different scenarios. How does it perform? And in terms of energy consumption, with 4 people in the house, with 7, with 11, with 16. In some houses, it's 22 in a 3-bedroom house in Australian remote communities. What about if it was in a tropical area, or in an arid zone, or in a hot, mild region? These are the 3 regions where the majority of discrete Aboriginal communities in Australia are located, those 3 climate zones. So what about in those things, how does it perform? Under current climate ranges, what about if we improved our typical house to the climate zone recommendations, as these are currently laid out in the Australian National Construction Code? Caveat: Indigenous housing on Crown land doesn't need to comply with the National Construction Code. But what if it did? What if it did? Would that make a difference? Should that be where activism and advocacy targets and concentrates its efforts? Okay, 366 simulations later, the houses are not currently able to offer residents thermal comfort and will not, even if a massive and expensive program of retrofitting to convert all the legacy stock to national standards took place. That is, even if public housing programs were built to code and superintended properly, which they are not, and even if they are maintained properly through well-resourced regimes, which they are not, they still will not offer thermal protection now, and they will not in the future, certainly will not in the future. Even if we and the world responded right now to the latest IPCC report, which we are not. Okay. So, brief glimpse into the why not. So the communities I was looking at, just looking at the last 20 years, November, December and January, and the number of days which are sitting over 30. I did this for the whole year. What that tells us is the summers are getting longer and they're getting more extreme, to the point where these places will be inhospitable to human life. We are mammals at the end of the day. We have a really slow temperature tolerance, really small bandwidth of tolerance. We have heart attacks. So the tottering infrastructure that pre-populates Indigenous housing is also a colonial life world. This legacy infrastructure needs to be decolonised, is what I'm trying to say. And the seemingly simple solution of saying, the decolonial approach philosophically of just saying, all right, here's the answer. Have Indigenous people design their own houses and have Indigenous people construct their own houses, have them do all the building. There's this really bizarre notion of sweat equity, somehow equals good maintenance, even when that's not how we maintain our own houses. Anyway, which comes out of a lot of that thinking from the barefoot doctor, 1950s idea of communal China, and that gets taken across to Australia and thrown onto Indigenous people, and they're meant to act as if they are all in communes, doing everything collectively. Right. These kind of concepts always travel. I say, of course community control matters, but it's no panacea. If you had to maintain your neighbourhood, right? Give me a spanner and see how your toilet works. It's not going to happen. Okay. So I'll take us to this. This is what the implications are so far of what I've been saying. There is a small optimism to what I'm saying, because if policies are so dispersed, so are our opportunities for intervening in policy life wilds. We have to choose our activity range. We can't think about it in the singular. We have to think about it as an ongoing act. I'll just recap that I had to introduce a different heuristic for thinking about policy, which is a challenge of concept and method, because the moment that you give somebody a case study, you're giving policy a coherent biography, which returns linearity and logic to something that you're trying to say has a small thread of logic and a whole lot of other things besides. So case studies are a really problematic kind of mechanism for narrating some of these concepts. However, let's recap. While obvious, as I tell it to you now, I hope it is obvious, that there's a connection between Indigenous circumstances, colonial occupation, unsustainable population growth worldwide, and climate change. For methodological and conceptual reasons, it's hard to make the connections. And we've talked about it in various spots. I know that we talk about our isolation from each other, the isolation of our knowledge forms, how difficult it is to, draw the connections. And then nonetheless, it hasn't come up, but I know that as a head of department and as a dean, I get told a lot, the anxiety about someone's track record for funding and so on. There's these biographical reasons why we don't join things up. But to re-see some of these connections, I had to devise a policy heuristic for distinguishing those three primary figures: policy artefacts, policy ambience, and policy hauntology. Policies operating as a palimpsest of inheritances and calcifications, reshaping already what happens next, what can happen next. It's a unified force field and a series of fragments, stutters, and abandonments. It's something which shapes psyches and physiques, and something which seemingly has no intentions. And understanding all of that helps me to retain responsibility for my embeddedness in and benefits from colonised life worlds, and not end analysis with a lame call for a better policy in the singular. Okay? You'll never see that from me. And then Indigenous social policy's primary function is to subtend extractive capitalism. That's a hard tonic to swallow, but I believe it to be true. To offer decolonial benefits, Indigenous social policy has to unwind extractive capitalism and the giant shakedown system that is the financialisation of everyday life. And the challenge then is how might such multiple heterogeneous laminations of past and present and future be harnessed for decolonial work? Well, somehow, even though I don't know how, we must transcend the barely checked ability of extractivism to drill, spill, contaminate, and induce our infrastructural dependencies. Now, of course, that's far too overwhelming, conceived as immediately and all at once we have to do that. But the converse is not dumbed down calls for better policy or co-design. Sorry, again. When we stop treating the state like it's a cop or a wise king, or an almighty culprit, and we stop pretending that decolonising institutions begins and ends with syllabus changes and revisions to our citations, we open greater opportunities for changing embedded, determining, overwhelmingly resilient inequalities in our life worlds. Now, it's interesting to me that in all these years, 30-some years of studying and thinking about and acting upon, intervening in, very, very full-bodied, as I confessed I'm a bureaucrat, confessed I'm a ministerial advisor, confessed I've made legislation. Many reasons for failure have been suggested to me. In audience like this, sorry, this is happening again. And they're recycled in political memoirs, in speeches, in academic analysis. Example, there was insufficient consultation or no consultation. Something was top down rather than bottom up. There were tactical or implementation errors. There was insufficient lead times or weak political will or contradictions between national and state and territory or multinational interests. There was inadequate capacity building within communities, neglect of place-based approaches, weak governance, corruption, or that elastic cliche, unintended consequences. But I've never seen the most obvious explanation that the impasse is born of an impasse, a hidden calculus in which the costs of no extraction for human beneficiaries is far too high compared to the massive immediate costs of having no extraction at all. Indigenous people get an invidious choice then about livelihoods and least worst paths. Companies get their profits, consumers get their goods, year-round strawberries, cancer treatments, and a militarised system of research and development and attack and defence binds the lot. When we acknowledge the connections, extractivism and colonised existence becomes viscous, adhering to our cell linings. So I think every act of decolonising is necessary, and I also think every act is insufficient. So it leads me to ask, and this is where I will end with the opening, is swiping dependency on Indigenous coloniality out of global bodies even a possibility? Or do we have to think of it differently? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tess. I think that gives us lots of things to think about policy and about extractivism. And I think in Taiwan there are lots of things to look at. I thought about your sidewalk story and hope you get to see the sidewalks in places like Tainan, where I live, where the shopkeepers extend their shops right out to the street and people proudly take over public space as they feel like. So anyway, I think this is really inspiring. We think about all kinds of policy. So I want to open up the floor to questions from the audience. I will ask you to please identify yourself and to keep your questions concise and to the point rather than making your own speech. So I'll now welcome some questions from the audience.
Early recess. Silence.
Thank you. Is this on? You can hear me? Yeah? Okay. Thanks for that wonderful talk. It was really, really fascinating. And I suppose this is a bit of an unfair question since you ended with the question of how to think about this differently for us, but I'm wondering, I'm taken with, and I found it very persuasive, this argument about the kind of, as the extractive kind of colonial infrastructures get into our cells. I like that imagery, but is part of the kind of possible solution maybe delineating the strands of that? Like, I'm wondering if that conception itself is maybe a bit too homogenizing, or if you think that there are sort of important, like, you know, is this back to kind of tracing commodity chains or something like that, of a sort of earlier era? Or what sort of methodological starting points do you kind of see for doing that? Does that make sense?
What's the that?
For thinking about these kinds of, for thinking about the prospects of decolonization sort of differently, I guess.
So a couple of things. Firstly, to repeat the disavowal, I'm here to say I don't know the answer to that. Wait, Tess. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. So what would I think about that? Firstly, I'm trying to push people away from the current trend that I see, or push people to take greater responsibility for the current trend that I see, which is to say we need to be in good relations with ellipsis. So you fill that spot with your solution. It could be good relations with, and I've seen this with toxicity, good relations with Indigenous ontologies, epistemologies, and good relations with the more than human. And I'm sort of breaking that down to say, okay, all right, what does that mean? Because we are in good relations with extractivism. Right? We are bodily in good relations. Is that differentiated? Yeah, I cut out a whole lot of stuff about how, you know, different bodies filter that differentially. Some with a very privileged high order access to the affordances of extractivism, and some with very blunt, life-shortening versions of it, and some others who are more kind of off-grid, still not entirely able. I mean, it's a romantic kind of concept that there are ways of surviving well off-grid entirely, communally, and have that be an intergenerational prospect that is not attacked. And we have this kind of halcyon kind of concept sitting behind a lot of analyses, but, you know, it's a very minoritarian view. If we're trying to think about global populations, the groundswell of, you know, population growth, which shows no sign of abating, what are we talking about in holding that as the solution? So I know I'm answering your question with a question. Ned. Behind you.
I'm not sure if it works. Is it working? I can't hear it. Yeah, Tess, that was really amazing, telling, and I love the nuances and sophistication running through your lines of analysis there. I was kind of curious how you ended there, following on from Adam's question a little bit, where you take us back to kind of hauntology in a way. I really like that sort of allusion and association to other kinds of work for other reasons. But the kind of conundrum you throw up there is curious because, you know, on the one hand, I think you correctly identify, if you like, the impossibility for kind of collective engagement. I very much liked your critique, passing as it was, of co-design for various reasons. But you kind of return to a kind of neurotic self through the kind of, and an individualization of address to decolonization. On this particular point, which was very viscous as a metaphor, and you said it, where, you know, decolonization manifests too on the cellular lining of the body through all of these extractive kind of processes that you identified. So you know, this is, I guess, the conundrum. On the one hand, the nation is the unit of a total analysis, given the sort of histories you're talking about. I know they come from outside as well, but nevertheless. But then we end up finally with this kind of odd neoliberal subject. I didn't really want to use that term, but that brings us to the individual, as if the individual and all their neuroses somehow address this process of decolonisation. I'm not asking for the solutions, you made that clear, but how you kind of work through, if you like, that conundrum.
Yeah, thank you, Ned. And I love that you give me more sophistication than I probably deserve, even in the question. I feel like I'm a really, just blunt thinker. So I would say this, that's actually deliberate, because I'm always thinking structurally. I'm always thinking about the tools for kind of population intervention or whatever. Like I've spent a lot of time doing that. And yet, when it comes to my take on many analyses of, you know, the what to do part, there is this deferral. It's to something other. It might be to better policy, or to, if we can only solve this conceptual conundrum in our thinking, then, you know, it's less stark than what the old Marxist, you know, analyses used to say, you know, unless we have the revolution, then blah, blah, and this is all this way of understanding labour, and this way of understanding gender, and this way of understanding, that's what we all need to understand before we can have our revolution. So we've got to get all our ducks lined up conceptually, and then we can have the revolution. It's not as bad as that, but it's still there. There's these refrains. And some of us have been commenting just casually amongst ourselves, us Australians in the audience, about how impossible some of the conversations that have been had here would be in the Australian setting. And that's because I think we have been taken over by a sort of a liberalism which does defer responsibility away from the self. So I'm sort of doing that a little bit provocatively to kind of sheet home responsibility, to make it less about being slick. You know, if we do this, then that. But I also have a very depressed comprehension that the answers have to be collective, structural and communal, and that's a very, for those of us who've learnt to enjoy being so atomised, that's an unpleasant prospect. And we haven't begun the experiments yet. We haven't begun them architecturally, spatially, in terms of our city designs. An example would be, and I was saying, I think it was Joyce, that an example of a decolonised cityscape would also be one where the roads are being ripped up, and most of them, and turned into water gardens, because we actually need to safeguard these cities for fireproofing, particularly in Australia. I mean, it's a really obvious thing to do. The last time you had that conversation anywhere at your university was? Right. So the individual thing is me just trying to say, all right, let's just stop absolving it, turning it into somewhere, Glencore, you know, whatever your baddie is, and turn it into, okay, I understand my implicity. Now, where does that take me to? Because I can't wish it away. I can't defer the responsibility to some conceptual purity, some position of pure denunciation. I'm impatient with that. And I'm also impatient with the easy get out of jail free, which is, oh, we just need to be in good relations with Indigenous people. They are burdened already by all of our impositions. Can we not load them with that too? Can we start taking responsibility for thinking this through and acting? What does that require? Sacrifices that most of us are not prepared to make. But can we at least start naming the analytical problems more accurately? That's a good starting point. And that I did say to Joyce this morning, that is the joy, that's my, the joy of being here, is that a space like this is really actually full of potential for finally having those kinds of conversation that don't seem possible in the liberal university settings of Australia right now.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. And yeah, my question would be to understand or share your pessimism with regards to decolonization and making kind of parallel with Oswald Spencer's pessimism. But I wanted to understand your take with that. His understanding is that colonization enterprise itself was part of a whole spiritual take with regards to the Faustian spirit of progress, exploration, but unfortunately which goes also with domination. So decolonizing would be just to change actors, but whoever takes this spirit will still go in the same direction. And we have had the example with Japan after Meiji era, who became a colonial power. We have the example now with China, who becomes also a colonial power. So would you read it in this sense that it is not just, you know, capitalism in one sense, in one side, and then, you know, the good side, which would be, let's say, humanism on the other, but it's a whole project, and that there is no ever decolonization whatsoever. It's just the change of actors of the global colonization, which will still continue. This is, I don't know if I made it clear.
If I've understood your proposition properly,
Yeah.
I think we're in fierce agreement. And I started with the Métis David Garneau's concept that it's a permanently unfinished project by definition. And I think that that concept also helps us to stop being so simplifying in what we suggest as the solution, because it has to be ongoing sets of enactments, because yes, there are counterforces, and those counterforces are within ourselves. So I guess to take it back to my thing with Ned, what am I insisting on? Those counterforces aren't just elsewhere, you know, the state. They are in ourselves too, our own desires, and our own determination to live well, to not die of disease prematurely. I mean, it sits within us. So changing actors, yes, but also I think having some really interesting prefigurative conversations about what different assemblages might actually mean, and how might we, not just, what does this term good relation mean? I mean, we need to conflict well. We need to live antagonistically well. You know, I don't like the tissues in my wash. How do I do that well? I mean, more than that. You know, now, I'm suggesting a form of communalism, clearly, implicitly, in my narrative, that there's going to come a time where we are forced into this, I think. In my lifetime, I don't know, maybe not. I'll be forced into a different commune called aged care, and it'll be hideous. But I do think thinking through these, because the counterforces, the desire of profiteering. In Honolulu, I was really interested in talking to property developers. They're fascinating with their honesty. They know that the buildings that they're putting up in the flood zones, in the surge zones, will have a 20-year lifespan. But they've done the maths. The profit they can make in that 20 years exceeds any sense of, you know, what a stupid thing it is to do. So I feel like that's happening. It's happening with the US eyeing the melting tundra and thinking, great, now we have unimpeded access to geoformations that we had difficult and more expensive, you know, disabled access to prior to now. Antarctica, the moves, the circling around of these Arctic zones, is telling us that that counterforce for continued colonisation, which we are responsible for too. So I can talk about those big forces, but I'm also trying to link it back to some of the choices that we are making. And why would I individualise that? Because that analysis, when it's presented so globally, does have an all-at-once impossibility. I can't stop those powers of extraction seeking their profits. I'm overwhelmed. Let me just go back to eating my strawberries. So I'm just trying to kind of push those things back into a connection.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was super inspiring, a talk. We already chatted a little bit after One Belt, One Road session, and I really want to read your recent book. I was so intrigued by the 3 categories, artifact, ambience, and hauntology. And I mean, gives us so much to think about, especially post-COVID, the air breathing, and also toxicity in the air and so forth. So many things to think about. But I'm a cultural studies person by training, so I just want to ask about where does meaning making lie? Meanings. Is there a place? I mean, in the first category, artifact, there is the discourse analysis aspect, but there's, at least in our globalization class, when I talk about the section on indigeneity and global networks of indigenous revitalization, there's that potential for meaning-making practices, like alternative ways of being and living in the world, that presents challenge of the normatives of colonized life. So I'm just really curious to hear what you think of where culture or meaning making is in those 3 categories. Thank you.
A beautiful question, thank you. So a couple of things. One is, when you understand the limits of policy and you don't put all your eggs in the basket of just policy in the singular, it could be better, you know, let's just ask for X, then you humble it. At the same time, you can be more canny. You can be more adroit in using the mechanisms and affordances of policy enablement to change some things. In the direction of meaning making and counter-hegemonic meaning making, I'll give a little example. So what attracted me to migrate to Canada in the first place, to UBC Okanagan, a little out of the way, funny little town in the middle of a valley, from, you know, a very good position at the University of Sydney. In Gender and Cultural Studies with Megan Morris, everybody, was the work that the Siouxs Okanagan were doing in terms of revitalisation, forcing the University of British Columbia into a treaty relationship whereby the university had to co-fund, in fact, majority fund, language revitalisation efforts, whereby 4-year degrees in vernacular language fluency are now on offer at great expense to the university. They will never make money. Hundreds of people need to be employed to get one student through, to the point where those students reacquire memory, rearm, and the communities talk about it in this way, rearm themselves with their knowledges for mathematics, for engineering, for astrology, astronomy, for architecture, for teaching, for law work, and more besides. It's simultaneously powerful, counter-hegemonic, and meagre. small, and fragile. I would say that as a permanent kind of requirement, anyone trying to get into and support counter-hegemonic mechanisms of any kind, pick your battle, be aware that it'll be all of those things, because the part which makes it easy is denied to you. It's counter-hegemonic. Equals will be difficult, will be obstacled. The things that have least resistance is the extractivist primary. Right? So no naivety, eyes wide open, humble, vital. I'm not answering it in relationship to the full heuristic, but I'm answering a different question that I'm often asked, because people feel like, but I'm in battle, I'm working in solidarity with X, Y, Z, and we've been doing this, thing trying to change the X for years, and it's really difficult, and you telling me it's useless. No, I'm not telling you it's useless. I'm telling you that that's exactly where an individual might put their efforts without overloading it with, and this is the solution for everything at large, eyes wide open, let's name that properly, analytically, let's step into that, take responsibility for it, etc. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tess. I think we are all here. We are here. Every one of us has a bit of optimism. Every one of us in our different situations or difficult problems to address. People feel powerless, frustrated. Okay. Not to mention some people. We feel we want to change, but we have several different directions of resistance that we don't want to be too idealistic or optimistic and jump into the slogan or campaign. But we also want to resist our compliance and complicit blindness. Okay, we turn our eyes away. Yeah, when you discuss this question about, it's not stable, right? Policy, I think it is so clever. I mean, also the ontology of it. That is, it's in our gene, as you said, blood, or inherited from our histories, and that is actually the gigantic mechanism of the state, the institution, the law, and education, and also the collective mentality that we are born into, and we share. We want to become one of them. We don't want to really be identified as idiosyncratic or whatever it is. But then we are oftentimes unconscious of the machine that's going on and that's pushing people toward their desperate conditions. So when we see people from Palestine or the second generation refugees of Palestinian people in Jordan and neighboring countries, or my students, okay, they are in the situation that they cannot at all change anything, but that's a policy over there. So, policy is how people regulate or institute the operation of the codes. It's everywhere, every place. and become policing or and everything. So it is it's very. I really appreciate that you make the problem of the policies into a more profound level that we need to face, we need to think. So I just want to thank you for that.
I wish unfortunately, I'm hoping that everything you just said was recorded, because I feel like that was a quite powerful formulation. Exactly. I was driven to analysing policy, I guess because I've been inhabiting a policy self for some different guises, but also because I couldn't clear the way to get on to what I wanted to understand about Indigenous situations and why really, really good and powerful ideas were always so difficult to implement. And that was my starting question. Why? Why, when things are in alignment with what the state is asking, so an Indigenous group is seeking to create employment opportunities cross-generationally in order to hold their families together, in order that they don't become unemployed, jailed or alcoholic, and they have a really explicit agenda about that, and you think, God, that lines up, doesn't it, with a betterment agenda from the state. Why is the realisation of that straightforward ambition so difficult, and when it's attained, so fragile? What is underlying this thing, which is clearly not just about alignment, assimilation, which would be one analysis, you know, that governmentality is towards assimilation. And well, if it was, you would aid and abet those ambitions quickly and swiftly with everything in your arsenal to help those different kinship groups realise their initiatives. Yet the opposite happens. So I was like, okay, well, that's something that needs to be understood. Oh, when I turned to the registers of policy analysis, they are sometimes they're just really boring and not useful. Cultural studies kind of let me down in that when it sort of turned to policy, it was always with a very self-interested kind of cultural policy. How do we get the creative industries recognised as a category, blah, blah, blah. It didn't actually help me understand what the phenomena itself was. Sort of took that for granted, that the category policy itself had stability and understandability, that it was comprehensible. But I didn't find it that way at all once you start to deconstruct it. So I had to waste a lot of time coming up with a heuristic so that I could then get back to my ethnography and ask my question. Then I hit the thing where people say, oh, but you've just taken away the mechanism of redress, that we ask for something simple in the singular. What would you have us do? And I say, no, fight your fight. I haven't taken anything away, but do it with more worldliness, more awareness of what you're actually up against. Do it more strategically, do it in alliance. I have taken to, and some of you know, Kirsty Howie, I have taken to fostering highly educated activists as part of our contribution to what we as scholars might be able to do, given our enablements inside institutions that are by definition advantaged and privileged and da-da-da. But you can actually do that. So you've got students, you just said in that narrative, coming to you from Palestine. I mean, that's in itself not nothing. Yeah.
Hi, Tess. Thanks so much for the presentation. I was struck by the way you were talking about extraction and extractivism in the talk, and how it's very much positioned in your thought as what you, I mean, maybe it was offhand, maybe deliberate, I don't know, but in one of your answers you refer to the extractive primary. So there's kind of a part of your analysis and everything you do with policy is based on the kind of identification as extraction and even extractivism, as you say sometimes, is the primary condition that we face. As a, practitioner of cultural theories and so forth, I sort of feel that some responsibility because I've sort of partaken in propagating this kind of idea that extraction is the problem that we face. But I'm just wondering whether that's something you want to press on or interrogate. Because when it comes to the what to do question, I mean, I think we have to ask, is it the condition that we face? Or is it only part of the condition? Or how is that condition negotiated differently in different parts of the world? I think about Latin America, for instance, where the so-called progressive governments almost kind of take on what you say at an individual level, that we have to recognize our complicity, and they say, we have to recognize our complicity as a state and extract and redirect it to social programs that will do good policy, that's a position. But I think it's worth pressing on that. Is extraction the problem, or are there other ones too?
I'm going to say yes and yes. Sorry. But yes, extractivism is the problem, and yes, there are other problems too. Is extractivism uniform in its manifestations? No. And can it be reconfigured? God, how problematic is that? Yes, but I feel like, and yes, just that's a different version of the language revitalisation program. A part of the sentence that is an unfinished project permanently, and only a way station at that, because more and more targeted extraction or oblivion extraction, we've got the two choices. Example, Northern Territory right now, with its suggestion of having the world's biggest fracking operation, is part of an agenda of extractivism which has pretty much said life here is not going to be viable, so we'll take what we can while we can. And we've actually tracked that in some documents, forecasts which say by 2040 or by 2050. So the ripping and the shipping there is accelerating under our noses, without public debate and blah, 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 right now. So that's one thing, extraction towards oblivion, towards desertification, or extractivism directed towards the good. These, yes, are choices, but I also feel like they're kicking the can down the road, and we have to actually delimit life worlds. And the things that extractivism has enabled, if there's some magic that can be substituted, which is less harmful for all the enablements, have at it. I hope research and development is somewhere, someplace looking at it. I can't see it at myself, but COVID, sorry, I'm rambling, but it's a really interesting problematic. COVID highlighted all of that. What we did during COVID was consume like crazy a whole lot of disposable things in relationship to ensuring our longevity. So the kind of the impulse response there was to screw all considerations about what any of this connects to, what factories produce these little packets. So it's interesting to think with, but I'd say yes and yes. Yes, it's the problem. Yes, there are other problems.
One more question. I can try.
We're all trying.
Yes, we're all trying. Yeah, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I have a question, and it comes from somewhere else, right? And this is that in the experience of Europe and how it deals with mobility, you know, I feel it's, you know, very much the same and different to what you have told us, right? There is clearly a wrong policy, doesn't work, it's destructive, it's deadly, it's, you know, everything that you want. And it produces a lot of, you know, it is profit for many, but it also doesn't achieve its aim, right? So what it says it does, it doesn't. It doesn't stop people from being mobile. It doesn't stop people from arriving, right? And I think that this is an interesting point in time where, you know, we have all developed different ideas and whatever we were able to do to somehow, you know, criticize this, you know, militantly, less militantly, politically, individually, humanitarianly, religiously, whatever it was, or by law, or whatever it was. So there's the point where, you know, you feel, okay, it is quite clear what is not working. And in terms of, you know, the environmental question, the climate question, it's also very clear, you know, I mean, there is all these reports say, you know, they don't propose a, you know, those who are settled and those who are mobile, so there is no opposition, and there's a we, right? We will be destroyed. We will not be able to live. And of course, we know all the differentialities in there, and who will be dying, etc., etc. But there's still this, you know, the question that you seem to ask is, you know, of course, also an impossible one. And this is that, how are we going to change this, right? But then, of course, that's impossible. And so, you know, I think the only question that I could ask back to your question is, so how are we going to ask differently? Because obviously, if there's a we, but there's no we, you know, the we is just an idea, you know, and this has been, you know, taken away constantly. Are we going to refrain back to divisions? What kind of divisions? That has been a very strong answer to your question, right? To say that we need to make these divisions very clear, and who is profiting and who is not, and how this needs to be changed. That was the answer historically. I mean, in a very simplified way, right? Mm-hmm. So is that the way around, or, you know, I mean, do you know what I mean? I mean, there needs to be a question that, you know, at least tentatively we can begin to answer, so that there is a path that we can go, and even if we need to integrate it constantly, to change it, but there needs to be some sort of way to do this, because the ontology is something that I think every generation of people who have struggled have lived with. You know, every generation knew that the history was a history of, you know, exploitation, oppression, etc., and that what we need to remember is the struggles against it. That has been the answer, right? So, is that the answer? Is that a question?
The problem for me is I don't drink alcohol. I feel like to answer what you just said, I need the bottle of red wine. Is that the answer? Is that the question? I'm going to circle back to a little more conversation I had with Joyce this morning, sitting on a bench quietly as we sipped. She sipped coffee, and I admired her beautiful outfit. One of many beautiful outfits that she's blessed us with. And it was to say that actually striving to have a probative analytics that stops with the easiness of dispensing using the latest fad kind of resolutions is actually something we can do. Is it enough? Of course not. That's also what I would always say about most things. It's never going to be enough because it's a permanently unfinished project. And to answer my own provocations, I'm quite clearly saying I resort absolutely at the drop of a hat to the affordances of a upper end quaternary health system when I need it. And that is to access at the upper end the glittery part of an enchainment, of an enmeshment in which damage is unfurling across space and time. So I acknowledge the impossibility, I acknowledge the implication, my complicity, my implicity, and yet insist that at least what we can do is name things well, because that does create interstitial breakthroughs, not monumental. I don't know how to do the monumental. I don't. I can only think bloodlessly. I said that at the beginning. And bloodlessly is quite tame.
Thank you. I think we're 5 minutes over, but we started late, so I think we have to end there. It was a good way to end it. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for your comments, your questions, and your attention.